saved by a doll? What can a doll do? Hi kids, this is Auntie Mila, and I have a story about a doll. Our verse today is Galatians 5:14. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's what it says. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's really short. You could memorize that, couldn't you? Oh, I'm sure you could. This story happened a long time ago, back when America was young and there were Indians and cowboys and settlers coming west. Well, the Apache Indians got really upset at the white people one time. And so they decided that they were going to surround this fort and they were going to make war with this fort, this big fort. And there were soldiers in the fort and families living in the fort. And there was a little girl by the name of Elisabeth. And she had a doll. And she loved that doll so much. She loved that doll with all her heart. She would take it everywhere. Everywhere she went, she would take this little doll, and she loved the doll. And she would play with it. You couldn't find Elisabeth without finding her doll. She always carried her doll wherever she went. And she played with the doll. She would talk to her doll. So Elisabeth loved her doll so much. She would play with it. She would feed it. And she would pretend like she was pouring tea. And then she'd say, would you like a drink? And she just loved her doll so much. The Indians were gathering around the fort. But Elisabeth couldn't care. She had her doll, and she just loved her doll so much. She would jump her up and down like you do a baby and go, you know how you play with a baby? And she just loved her doll. Anyway, one day, some soldiers were outside of the fort, and they were scouting around and looking for the Indians. They were looking here and looking here. And they found a little Indian girl. And she was crying, woo, woo. And they looked and thought, she must be lost. So they went and picked her up, and oh, she didn't want them to pick her up. But they picked her up anyway. They couldn't leave her there in the woods. Something bad might happen to her. So they picked her up, and she was crying. Ah, ah. And they carried her back to the fort. And she wouldn't stop crying. She cried. Woo! She cried and cried and cried. She wanted her mommy and daddy. But they didn't know where her mommy and daddy were. And so they didn't know what to do. She would not stop crying. And then the commander of the fort remembered his daughter Elisabeth had a doll. And he went to Elisabeth. He says, oh, Elisabeth, this little girl is so stressed. She's crying and crying and she won't stop crying. Do you think that you would mind giving your doll to her? Maybe that would distract her and maybe she would stop crying. And Elisabeth looked at her doll. Oh, but she loved her doll. And her daddy said, well, it would really help this little girl. She's crying. Can you hear her? And listen. Oh, yeah, they heard her crying. And so Elisabeth said, okay, she can have my doll. And her daddy says, come. And so they took her to the little Indian girl who was crying and crying and crying. She wanted her mommy and she wanted her daddy. And she was with these white people and they looked so scary. And Elisabeth went to her, and when she saw Elisabeth, she stopped. And she looked at Elisabeth's doll. And you know what Elisabeth did? She says, would you like my doll? And she patted passed it to her, and the little Indian looked. She had never seen a pretty doll like that. And she took the doll, and she stopped crying. And she looked at the doll, looked it all over, and she was fascinated with the doll, absolutely fascinated. And she took it and she held it like this, and she started rocking it. And she liked the doll so much, that made Elisabeth happy. Well, it was getting late at night, so they didn't want to go out that night. But the next day, when the sun came up, the soldiers said, "We need to take this little Indian girl back to her mommy and daddy." And she was hanging on to the doll. And Elisabeth said, "She can have my doll." Isn't that nice of Elisabeth to give her doll, even though she loved her doll so much? And so they picked up the little Indian girl with the doll, and they carried the Indian girl back to her mommy and daddy. They had to go through the woods for a long ways, and then they found the Apaches, and they said, "Here, we brought your little girl." They said, "Oh, thank you." And her mommy was so happy to have her, and her daddy said, "Thank you very much." He was a big chief in the Apache tribe. And they said, "Thank you so much." And she kept the doll. And the soldiers went back to the fort. They said, "Well, the Indians are really gathering. More tribes are coming on their horses, and they're getting ready to attack us. So we better get ready." They closed the big gates. But the next day they looked out, and they saw an Indian lady and a big chief coming up on their painted horses. And the Indian lady got off the horse, and they opened the gate, and they said, "Oh, we brought the doll back to you because this is your doll." And they said, "Oh no, you can have the doll. Elisabeth said she could have the doll." And the mother said, "Really? Because it's so special." And the father, the big Indian chief, it touched his heart. And he went back to his warriors and said, "We're not going to attack that fort. We are not, because they rescued my little daughter, they took care of her, and they gave her a doll." Because dolls were very special back then. You couldn't buy them at Walmart, because there was no Walmart. And they said, "We're not going to attack because those white people were very nice to us." And then all the tribes are coming up with their war paint, ready to fight. And the chief says, "No, we're not going to fight." He says, "We aren't? Yeah, but they've taken our land and this and this." Indian chief said, "No, we're not going to fight. Because they rescued my little daughter. They were kind to her. They fed her. They took good care of her. And they gave her a doll. They are nice people. These white people here are nice. We're not going to fight them." And so all the tribes started going off. They all went off, and the little Indian girl had a little dolly to take with her. So that's how a doll saved a whole war, a whole battle, a big fight. Because Elisabeth was kind to this little Indian girl. Isn't that a sweet story? I want to pray. Dearest Father in heaven, thank you so much that Elisabeth had it in her heart to give the doll away, even though she loved it very much. And it stopped a war. Help us to be kind, Lord, to our neighbors and love our neighbors. For Jesus' sake, amen. Thank you for coming by. We'll see you next time. Bye! Can you wave bye?